This is going to be a video about anime tropes, but not the standard way it's done on this site. This isn't going to be one of those videos where I say the names of some cliches in the hopes that it convinces people that I've watched more than one anime in an experience that boils down to, so what's the deal with tsunderes, am I right? This also isn't going to be one of those hour-long affairs with titles like name of anime, comma, trope, and broader societal issue, where I try and convince you that something happening in an anime is cause for concern and the only hopes of counteracting it is to subscribe to literally every one of my political beliefs and then donating your life savings to my Patreon. No, this is a video about anime tropes that could only be made by me. Why? Because every instance I'm going to mention is needlessly specific in a way that doesn't even make them tropes and really just makes them coincidental recurrences. I've kind of undermined the point of this video now that I phrase it like that. TLDR, these are small things that I've seen in more than one anime that I like or dislike. Really could have just phrased it that way, but I've never been known to stray away from throwing unnecessary shade. Though, speaking of people who insult others to hide their own flaws, one trope which I personally like, although one I could understand why others would dislike, is the concept of protagonists who start off as unlikable outcasts. Now, why would I be into a protagonist who's hard to identify with? Well, firstly, unwashed dickheads who never leave their rooms is something I don't necessarily find difficult to empathise with, and secondly, I like the unapologetic nature of some of these portrayals. For example, I watched the first episode of You about a year ago, and I could barely get through the first 20 minutes. I was told the main character was meant to be a mentally deranged stalker, and yet the writers made him an overly charismatic quip machine who's really nice to everyone, while also having an apartment and a stable job. Not that I'm endorsing mentally deranged stalkers, but frankly, I felt like it was a bit of a cop-out on the writer's part. So compare this with anime characters like Jinta from Anohana, who is a social recluse who hasn't talked to anyone in years, who acts like, well, a social recluse who hasn't talked to anyone in years. In fact, Winter 2021 had 3 MCs who were like this. Subaru was completing the character arc that he'd started in the first half of ReZero Season 2, Ai was easily the best aspect of One Direct Priority, and Rudeus' lingering insecurities despite being in a completely new world is something that might end up netting him the Best Protagonist prize at this year's Degeneracy Awards. For those who don't know, the Degeneracy Awards are what I call my annual anime awards, although come to think of it, he does deserve an award for his degeneracy, and I mean that in a loving way. Now, some of the presence of this trope is to do with the presence of hikikomoris in Japanese society, but at the same time, it does make sense from a storytelling perspective, since having the protagonist start off at a low point means they have room to develop an arc. And this is something that Megalobox Nomad did very well, which is also one of my favourite shows this year. Although, there's one thing I picked up on. In this show, we see Mac reading his son a book called The Nomad and the Hummingbird. It tells the story of a nomad who wants to die, listening to a hummingbird song. The bird dies, and so the nomad buries them. The nomad eventually reaches the ocean by singing that bird's song, and when the ocean asks to grant their wish, they ask to go home. It parallels the emotional journey of Joe and Chief, and also contains references to the recurring hummingbird motif throughout the series. But one thing was niggling at the back of my mind while Mac was reading this book to his 6-year-old son. What kind of fucking kid's book is this? Yeah, anime is a thing for weirdly morbid children's books, since it also made an appearance in Fairy Tail, where the key to the Starry Heavens book was about a little girl who wants to collect 6 keys that will bring her happiness, but it makes everyone around her suffer. And then when they collect all of them, turns out they were actually used to power a doomsday device. This was apparently Lucy's favourite book as a child, but she didn't remember that critical junction, because this arc had to last at least 25 episodes. And then in a combination of both the books I've just mentioned, Blackrock Shooter features a book called The Bird and the Colours, at least that's how the wiki translates it, which is about a bird that flies around getting colours on it until it gets too many colours on it and then it carks it. Now that's what I call coloured dye. Reusing footage is convenient. But what's interesting is that the protagonist, Mato, you guessed it, didn't remember that part of the book until much later, despite this book being the only sodding thing she goes on about for 8 episodes. I mean, maybe children's books are like this in Japan? If so, then I guess it says something about young Japanese reader demographics. Namely that they fucking hate birds. On the subject of small people's relationships with paper, another anime trope I like is characters who use notepads to show their emotions. Who says I'm not the king of segues? These characters, which I'm now going to refer to as Drew-deres, are ones I've only seen in 2 places. Rina in Nijigasaki and Kino in Senryu Shoujo. Coincidentally, Kino is the way I'd describe this trope. It's nice seeing a character create their own expressive face when they feel they're unable to. This is something you can only really do in an animated medium, because if you tried this IRL, you'd only end up with a stiff wrist and the potential to ruin a few sheets of paper. And frankly, I've already got an activity I do in real life that gives me a sore wrist and involves using a bit of paper. Now, yes, this trope doesn't do anything for the story, but nothing has to be profound for me to like it, such as Senryu Shoujo itself, since it's an instant go-to when I think of comfy anime. Although there is one moment that had me a little frustrated in that show, and that was the 12th episode, when it turned out that Nanako and Eiji actually knew each other before the events of the show, which to me was a little contrived. This is something that I've seen in several anime, where you'll have an arc where it's, I remember when someone who I didn't know the identity of did something nice for me, oh look, it was the person I've known all along. The problem is less the occurrence itself, more that we see it coming a mile off, so you're just sitting around waiting for the characters to learn the obvious. This also happened with Gugu and Rin in To Your Eternity. And while there's a slight variation with Gugu knowing and Rin not, you're trying to tell me that Gugu went 4 years without saying anything? Not even when he was drunk, he didn't decide to go, Oi, Blondie, it was me who pushed you over, and you better be thankful because you could have ended up looking like a 4K rendering of a Donkey Kong fail screen. Then there's my least favourite iteration of this trope, which I call the Yo, it was Nem from the future. In Fairy Tail's 6th OVA, Lucy ends up saving, and subsequently inspiring, her younger self to join Fairy Tail, which in fairness isn't something I was anticipating, because it was never brought up at any point by Lucy, despite its apparently being a life-altering event. There are ways this trope can be done well, namely the way that Your Lie in April does it, but that's something I dare not spoil, since showing it out of context would ruin it. Although here's a moment I'd be very happy to show you without context. I love this. And weirdly, for purely innocent reasons. This isn't because I'm thinking anything lewd, it's just because I find the way that Japanese VAs enunciate licking to be kind of funny. We've already covered this bit from Dragon Pilot, but there's also this part in a recent Dragon Maid episode, where Toru made a majestic ballad with the insightful lyrics, Miss Kobayashi, love, lick, kiss, and while I'd be a fool not to mention the legendary Kakyonu, credit should also go to Poldaref's. Is this me admitting that my sense of humour is so immature that I find someone waving their tongue at me hilarious? Yes. Do I have a rebuttal for this? One final thing I want to talk about in this video is the presence of stage plays in anime series. This isn't when anime series get made into stage plays, as many of them do, I mean how some plot lines within them circulate around the characters putting on a stage play. Now, I understand that you want all elements of the story to link back to each other, and so you'll want the plays being staged to have something to do with the actual events in the story. One scene that does this really well is Shirobako, where Shizuka goes to see a rehearsal for Waiting for Godot, and starts to piece together how she should not be sitting around waiting for her respective Godot in the fear that it will never come. This fits really well. However, it's not easy to find a play with such a fitting narrative to the events of your show, and thus the writers have to make their own. And to put it lightly, well, it's not exactly Chekhov, is it? I rewatched Beastars, Review Starlight, and Nijigasaki High School Idol Club to write this bit, and in each of them, the plays consist of, I am person with desire to do something to do with destiny. I won't let you do that. Have at thee. Okay. Now, this kind of monologue-based performance isn't exactly unrealistic, since there is the Geki Noa style of theatre in Japan. Except each of these examples are in Western settings, and speaking as someone who knows a bit about Western theatre, it isn't that ambitious. It isn't elaborate sets with dazzling fight scenes, it's typically 2 to 4 people, all in black t-shirts, standing around making the talking points listed in whatever newspaper the playwright happened to be using for verbatim. And wouldn't you look at that, in Review Starlight, say it with me now, Karen forgot the plotline to the story she had idolised since she was 4. I bloody hate it when people forget stuff for the sake of moving things along. I mean, what if I forgot how to end a video in a satisfying manner?